Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Feston, and thanks for being with us. This week, we're going to be taking a closer look at both of the chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, focusing in on the tightest races that'll decide control of both chambers. Today, I'm joined by Erin Covey, who leads the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter's coverage of the U.S. House of Representatives. Erin was actually on the show a little earlier this year, around February, to unpack how the House was looking in the early stages of 2024, so we're excited to welcome her back on the show with just a few weeks to go to the election.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So, all 435 of the House of Representatives seats are up for grabs this election season. Here at Ballotpedia, we're tracking 53 of those as battleground races, so we're expecting about 13% of these races to be truly competitive. Democrats hold 28 of these districts and Republicans hold 25 heading into the election. And looking at the breakdown, Republicans currently have a 220 to 212 majority with 3 current vacancies. Democrats need a net gain of 5 districts, if I have my math right, to win the majority in the chamber. Can you break down that math for us a little bit more?
Yeah, that's right. So control of the House is incredibly narrow right now. And then when we're looking at the battleground of competitive House races, which, there is some variance between the different forecasters, but I think we largely see the battleground the same way. And it is pretty evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats, which means that on the whole, control of the House is truly a toss-up at this point. And, I know 538 came out with their House model a couple of days ago, and it literally said when it was released, there was a 50-50 chance of either party controlling the House. So I found that validating because I've been saying all cycle this is a toss-up, and people hate that, of course, but it truly is. I promise it's not just a cop-out.
Yeah, you're supposed to be the oracle, right? You need to give us the answers. We need to know.
I know.
This information, as you're mentioning, changes so quickly. It's really hard to keep up, but Cook just moved 2 races towards Republicans and 5 towards the Democrats, and little shifts in either direction can really mean a lot this late in the race. So what changed in the 2 races you shifted towards the Republicans? Let's start there if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I'll just say that one interesting thing about this cycle is that you have these kind of cross currents going in different regions of the country that are kind of shaking up the conventional wisdom, I think, around a lot of these House races. So, for example, in places like California and New York, that's where Republicans really made gains in 2022. And these are states that in a presidential cycle, these districts will be harder for Republicans to hold. But they're still not quite as hard as you think they would be. And that's because from what we're seeing in the polling, it kind of seems like these states may just be trending a little bit away from Democrats in general. And it's not just a fluke of the 2022 cycle and maybe some unpopular governors at the top of the ticket. And so we have places like in the districts in the Central Valley that are very competitive, that we have rated as a toss-up. And these are districts that Biden won by double digits in 2020. So you would think it would be quite difficult for a Republican incumbent to win re-election there. But we're not expecting Harris to win them by the same margin that Biden won them by 2020. Now, she's certainly doing much better than Biden was doing in these districts before he dropped out. Biden had been an anchor on House Democrats and Democratic candidates across the country. But Harris is still, even while she is reaching Biden's 2020 numbers in other districts, she is still underperforming him kind of in these coastal regions. And so that is part of the story in terms of the shifts that we've made. At the same time, she is hitting Biden's numbers in these Midwestern parts of the country, particularly areas that contain a lot of white, highly college-educated suburban voters. And she's even overperforming him in certain places. So recently, I moved 5 districts in Democrats' direction. And these were kind of largely in the Midwest. One was in Montana, so that's not really the Midwest. But, the other 4 were definitely in the Midwest. And 2 were in Iowa, places that before we had it rated lean Republican. And they were districts that Trump narrowly won, basically, in 2020. And going into the cycle, we expected he would win them again by a similar margin or even a larger margin. That appears to not be the case. It looks like Harris is actually doing better in these districts, which it's kind of like the Des Moines suburbs. That's Iowa's 3rd district, highly competitive, held by a Republican. And then Iowa's 1st district as well. That's in the southeastern part of the state that includes a couple of colleges as well. So, we see that Harris has been doing across the board better with college-educated white voters, and that is impacting Democrats' prospects in some of these districts as well, and that's why they're on the rise in places like Iowa or in Nebraska. At the same time, there are places where Harris isn't doing quite as well, and maybe Republicans have stronger incumbents as well. And that is why we also moved a couple of races towards Republicans. So one of those that I'll talk about is New Jersey's 7th district. This is a district that Biden won by a couple of points in 2020, not by a huge margin, but by about 4 points. But Republicans were able to flip it in 2022 and oust the Democratic incumbent there. And the new Republican incumbent, Tom Kean Jr., is the son of a popular former governor and just kind of has a more moderate profile than a lot of House Republicans. And so he has been able to kind of outperform the maybe slight Democratic lean at the top of the ticket. And that's made it really difficult for Democrats to go on offense there. It's also in the really expensive New York City media market. And so it costs a lot more for Democrats to spend money there. And we didn't see a lot of the Democratic outside groups coming in to help the Democratic candidate, Sue Altman, there like they have been in other races. And so we moved that race, which was previously in the toss-up category, into lean Republican. So, there's some of these differences come down to candidate quality. Sometimes it just comes down to the demographics of the districts. But all in all, these still account for largely a very close race for the House. And neither party has an advantage. I guess if I had to point towards one that maybe had a slight advantage, Republicans, I think, probably have the narrowest of advantages right now if you do the math on our ratings. But even then, it is certainly, it's not big enough to say that it leans one direction.
It seems like if I'm picking out, some that I'm noticing from you talking there, a lot of assumptions that we've made about different districts and different states are being upended. I feel like we've seen that in other aspects of the elections this fall. Can you speak to that at all? Are you finding that, like, as you're looking at these different districts, it's kind of,
Yeah.
it seems like there are a lot of surprising things that you're noticing.
And I think it's because we've seen a bit of realignment within the two political parties in terms of the demographic makeup of them. We have seen white college-educated voters that Republicans used to win really move towards Democrats heavily in the past 8 years or so. And at the same time, we have seen Republicans make serious gains with working class voters. Obviously, their gains with white working class voters have been well documented, but that also extends to Latino working class voters as well and Black working class voters. And so that's why you have these districts like in the Central Valley, for example, or in Southern California that are quite diverse. Some of them are majority Latino that you would think typically, like if you're thinking of conventional wisdom, they would lean more Democratic. But a lot of these demographics have been shifting more towards Republicans and more willing to vote for Republicans in recent years. And it seems like a lot of that is in part due to the class divide. But, there's all these other kind of competing dynamics as well. Some of it in like California and New York is that voters have been frustrated with Democratic leadership in the state and believe that the party has gone too far to the left on issues like crime. And so that's part of the story there. And then, at the same time, you have places that have like full Republican control of the government now, like Iowa, where now voters feel like Republicans have gone too far right on issues like abortion and education. And so you have these different populations that are maybe getting activated by slightly different issues more. Now, largely it's a presidential year, and the main issues that matter across the country are the main issues that matter in these districts as well. And that's the economy largely, followed by immigration and abortion access. But, these little differences from region to region can make the difference in these House races, which then could make the difference in control.
Can you take us into the tightest of the tight races? I'm sure even among those that you're shifting lately, and I think if I recall correctly, in weeks prior, you might have shifted even a few other races. Are there a handful of contests where both parties and pollsters and analysts like yourself are looking to among the group of battleground contests that will really sway the outcome the most?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think there are, if you look within our toss-up column, there are nuances. And I think there's districts that I can say are slightly more competitive than others. Some of the interesting races that I'm watching in the toss-up column that are held by Democrats are 2 open seats in Michigan. These are Michigan's 7th district, which is in mid-Michigan, includes the capital city of Lansing and MSU. And then you also have Michigan's 8th district, which includes Flint and the Tri-Cities area. So these are both districts that Biden narrowly won in 2020, but Trump could win them in 2024 just because it was so close. Even if Harris is still winning Michigan narrowly, these are districts that are just so evenly divided that you could easily see either presidential candidate carrying them. They're also both open seats because the 2 incumbents who hold them are retiring. They're both Democrats. And so that also makes them a little bit better opportunities for Republicans to flip. Both the incumbents that were sitting there, that's Elizabeth Slotkin, she's running for Senate in Michigan now, and Dan Kildee, who's retiring. They were both really strong incumbents who were strong fundraisers and had done quite well in 22 relative to the partisan lean of their district. But now you basically have kind of two more generic candidates running against each other that have less defined brands than an incumbent would have. So those are two interesting ones that I think could determine control. I think, within those two, Michigan's 7th district might be a slightly better pickup opportunity for Republicans, but really hard to say because they're both super close. And then on the Republican side, I think the most vulnerable incumbents there are probably Congressman Anthony D'Esposito in New York's 4th district. He represents a western chunk of Long Island that it leans pretty Democratic at the presidential level. Biden carried it by 14 points in 2020. But Long Island has really been moving towards Republicans in the past couple of years. And D'Esposito was able to flip this seat in 22. And so we still think this is a very competitive race, but just because of the partisan lean of the district, he is in one of the toughest positions. And then I'll also point out Brandon Williams. He's the only incumbent who we have in a category that opposes him. And so he's a Republican incumbent, but he's in a lean Democratic category, which means that by our ratings, he is the most vulnerable incumbent in a general election, basically. So he represents a district in upstate New York that when New York redrew its map at the beginning of the year, became a couple points even more Democratic. And Brandon Williams only narrowly won his race last cycle. And he's also a little bit more conservative than some of the other Republicans who represent competitive districts in New York. And so I think that is definitely Democrats' best pickup opportunity in the country, which is why we have it in the lean column. And then they also have pickup opportunities in California. And I'll point out in California's 13th district, John Duarte also had an incredibly close race in 2022, represents a district that Biden won by double digits. Harris might not win it by double digits, but she's going to be winning it by several points most likely. So it's going to be really difficult for him to overcome that, particularly as a freshman who has a less well-defined brand. And then Mike Garcia in California's 27th district, this is kind of in the northern suburbs of LA County. He's also representing a district that Biden won by double digits. And while, again, Harris may not do quite as well as Biden did in 2020, she's still probably going to win it by several points. So he is in a really tough position as well. So those are probably Democrats' best pickup opportunities in the country, whereas I would say Republicans' best pickup opportunities are Michigan's 7th district, Michigan's 8th district, because they're open. And then you also have the 5 Democrats who represent seats that Trump won in 2020. So there's a lot of talk about the 16 Republicans who represent the Biden seats. They get a lot of attention, but there's also the 5 Democrats who represent the Trump seats. So they're already fighting against political gravity because Trump is likely to win these seats again. And that list includes Mary Peltola in Alaska, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez in Washington State, Jared Golden in Maine, Marcy Kaptur in Ohio, and Matt Cartwright in Pennsylvania.
It's always interesting to monitor how Democrats are doing in districts that Trump won in the 2020 election and vice versa for the Republicans representing districts that Biden won in that election. How many of these districts are there?
Yeah, so there's 16 districts that Republicans represent that Biden won in 2020, and then 5 districts that Democrats represent that Trump won in 2020. So only 21 crossover districts. And because House results are so strongly correlated with presidential results, these incumbents' prospects are kind of largely going to be defined by how the presidential race plays out here. So in 2020, just another number that kind of helps illustrate this, there were only 16 congressional districts that voted one way at the top of the ticket and the opposite way in the congressional race. And so being able to convince voters to split their ballots in this hyper-polarized day and age is a difficult thing to do. But I think a lot of the incumbents, I would say on both sides of the aisle, are in a pretty good position to do that and have worked hard to define their brands in a way that most incumbents don't have to, because they know that they're going to have to win over Trump voters or Harris voters.
What are some hypothetical scenarios for Democratic or Republican control? I know it's a tough question to answer, because so much of that has to do with who controls the presidency, who controls the Senate. All of that definitely impacts, what the House is able to do. But what might some of the priorities be for both parties if they do gain or retain, for the Republicans, control of the House this fall?
So, I think a lot of that depends on what happens, obviously, in the presidential race and the Senate race. The Senate race is likely to go to Republicans. And that's just because the Democrats are defending seats in red states that are going to be difficult to win. And in fact, if Trump wins the presidential race, then even if Democrats hold the seats in Montana and Ohio, that's still enough for them to have control, just because West Virginia is going to flip to Republicans because the former Democratic senator there, now independent Senator Joe Manchin, is retiring. And so Democrats have a really difficult task to pull off. They have a couple of potential offensive opportunities in places like Florida and Texas and, surprisingly enough, Nebraska. But those are all places that still lean Republican. And so we still think that the more likely option is that Republicans have control of the Senate. So in that scenario, even if Harris wins the presidency and Democrats are able to win the House, that is a split government scenario that we actually haven't seen in modern history, where you have a president of one party and the opposing party holding the Senate. So that's going to impact things like confirming cabinet appointments and judges and that sort of thing. So I would expect it to be a contentious 2025 kind of regardless, because I also don't think it's going to be that either party has a large majority in the House. I think probably either party could make gains in the single digits. I wouldn't expect either party to pick up more than 10 or so seats. And for Republicans, if they pick up 10 seats, then they have a 14-seat majority, which is definitely more comfortable than their majority now, but is still relatively close. And then for Democrats, if they pick up 10 seats, that gives them only a couple of seats in the majority. And so it's going to be really difficult for either party to really get things done, because it does seem likely that we're headed towards a divided government. Although I will say that it's also just as likely that Republicans could sweep all three levers of control. And so that also is because the presidential race is so close and the House is so close, that is also probably a really strong possibility as well. So, I think whether or not Republicans have full control of the government is going to come down to what happens in the presidential race and the House. But I think if it is split, then we can expect more gridlock. And probably, I don't know how the fight for Republican House leadership would go if Republicans do retain the majority in the speakership fight. I think after the precedent that was set last year, we can expect that to get contentious as well.
Well, Erin Covey of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Best of luck this fall. We really appreciate your insights, and we'll definitely have to talk to you in the new year.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Frank.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We've got some of Cook's analysis linked in there as well, so be sure to check that out. We'll be back later this week with another episode. We'll be tackling the Senate in that episode, so be sure to stay tuned. There's a few tight contests there that we're going to dig into that I think you guys would really like to hear about. Make sure to subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks again for listening. We'll see you later this week.